And welcome to the King Institute for Faith and Culture yet again. We meet on a convocation on a Monday. It's good to be back in this swing again. Good to have you with us this morning. Whether you're here in person or online, we're glad you're with us for this consideration of the intersections of faith and culture. This year's theme is listening to your life. We're following Fred Buechner's charge to try to find the voice of God woven through our own lives and through the lives of others. And as part of that series, it seemed appropriate to spend a moment to mark the many lives that were lost on 9/11, 20 years ago on Saturday. And for a lot of us, there are indelible memories of that day, a day that started off with a blue sky and ended with a changed world, a day that becomes one of those markers in your life where you remember things differently before and after. And it's a day that calls for sober reflection and for, now 20 years later, theological reflection. And that's what we've asked Vince to come and do for us today. Vince Bacote is a professor of theology at Wheaton College in Illinois, where he comes to us, whence he comes to us today. He's originally from Maryland. He's a graduate of the Citadel in South Carolina. He then went to do a theological degree at Trinity Seminary in Chicago and did a PhD at Drew University in New Jersey. He specializes in the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper, but he's written very broadly. His books include Reckoning with Race and Performing the Good News, The Political Disciple, A Theology of Public Life, which is a recent publication in a great series by Gene Green, and The Spirit in Public Theology, Appropriating the Legacy of Abraham Kuyper. In addition, he's written a great deal for publications including Comment Magazine and Christianity Today. He has blogged for the Institute of Faith, Economics, and Work, and he has brings with him extensive publication and teaching and a lot of time thinking and reflecting on the role of Christians in public life, and he's going to bring those to us today. He resides in Chicago with his wife and 2 daughters, and we're glad he's with us. Please join me in welcoming Vince Bacote.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me and for the privilege of speaking about such a challenging circumstance for many of us. If you happen to look at the announcements for today, you'll see that my title is Learning from Looking Back. And many of us in recent days have heard the phrase, never forget. And to remember is to look back, and many of us look back and ask how our view of the past informs our present perspective on life. The interesting thing about that is there's a kind of unspoken assumption when people are saying, remember, never forget. And the unspoken assumption is that it's as if everybody is looking back through the same lens. That we all know what it was, and we all kind of know how we should be looking at that. That there's a common set of lenses for our perception that will hopefully orient us towards some kind of common response and some kind of trajectory towards our better selves. And the thing is that you may be aware that we're in a time in the United States of America when people are saying we do not look through the same lenses, that we are quite divided. But in a context like this one, I want to invite us to think through a specific set of lenses. Those are a theological set of lenses, through the lenses of Christian beliefs. And here's what I mean by that. I don't mean, as a person who teaches theology for a living, that somehow in 30 minutes I'm going to talk about every single doctrine that Christians have articulated, and for each one of those doctrines, here's how we will look back. I mean, that's a book-length project, and I'd be happy to do that at some other time. But that's not what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about 3 ways that I want us to look back, and for each of those, there are certain beliefs I'm going to ask us to consider. And here's the thing. Some of you wear glasses, some of you wear contacts, and you know that depending upon your prescription, you see things a certain way. And what if you got the wrong prescription, or you've had a certain prescription and your eyes have changed? You don't see things the same way. Some things may be really tightly in focus, and other things may be fuzzy. Or you might not see certain things at all. And so what I want us to do is to be intentional about the way that certain Christian beliefs can help us look back at some of the dimensions of what happened with 9/11 and really our response to 9/11. So I want us to think about looking back at three different things, and then I want us to consider the theme listening to your life as a response. So first, looking back at tragedy. Chances are that I can assume that in this room, that if I just say 9/11, you know what I mean. Right? That everybody knows that what that means. Now, of course, there were lots of September 11ths before 2001, and there have been many afterwards. But when people say 9/11, it immediately, at least if you're a citizen of this country, it takes you back to 2001. Now, some of you, because I don't know where you are in your time at King, some of you may not have been born yet, or the rest of you, if you're students, you were quite young when it happened. So you may not have the memory of where you were, but your parents do. And so the term 9/11 instantly brings us back to a day of great, unforgettable tragedy. And though you probably heard it over and over in the last few days, I'm just going to repeat a few of the facts that happened. Hijacked planes by terrorists, smashing into iconic buildings, smashing into first one tower of the World Trade Center, then another tower of the World Trade Center, then the Pentagon, and then going for, we don't know which iconic building in DC, but because of a passenger-led revolt, instead that plane smashes into the ground in Pennsylvania. Then later, as the day goes on, the Twin Towers collapse. Nobody thought they were going to see that happen. Then we count the toll, and we discover that nearly 3,000 lives are lost. And everybody remembers, or most everybody remembers, where they were as all of those events occurred. We're familiar with those details, and if you weren't, you are now. But we're familiar with them, but how do we look back through those through a Christian lens? Not just describing a tragedy that happened with all of that loss of life. But what else is it? How do we interpret that if we're looking at that through a Christian lens? You know, one of the most fundamental things that you learn from the Christian faith is that there is something called sin and evil. And the thing is that when you look at what happened on 9/11, you cannot escape the fact that sin and evil are real. Now, that may seem to be a very obvious thing that I'm saying, but I'm not convinced that people actually really always believe that sin and evil are real, particularly if you live in the United States of America, because the United States of America is a very optimistic country. We may be divided, but part of what people are fighting about is how they're going to get to their optimism because of what they believe we're supposed to be able to do in the United States of America. We're very, very optimistic. And sometimes when you're that optimistic, you think that sin and evil are exceptional. But the fact of the matter is, sin and evil are not exceptional. In fact, not only are sin and evil real and not exceptional, what it really tells us is it's not exceptional that because of sin and evil, Humans will do their worst. In fact, for some humans, it's as if you said to them, do your worst. And they go, watch me, and I'll do even worse. I'll do evil beyond what you can imagine. In fact, think about it this way. Some of you might be into horror movies. Hey, I'm into cinema. It's cool. But here's the thing. The true horror story, the greatest horror story, begins in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, when sin enters the world. Because ever since then, human beings have been looking for ways to be in opposition to others and to at least antagonize and at most destroy others. It's not atypical. It's actually an unfortunate new normal that entered the world when sin entered the world. And my point is that if that's the true horror story, then what we saw in 9/11 was one example of horrors that have been real ever since sin and evil entered the world. Massacres, as much as we might like to believe it, are not exceptional. It's terrible. 3,000 lives, nearly 3,000 lives lost, but it's actually one example of when something like that happened. Now, why am I saying that? Am I saying that to say, hey, so don't remember, it's just another bad thing? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, yes, it's terrible. Yes, the scale is massive. No, it's not exceptional. Because there have been a lot of them. And there will be more. And there have been some since then. Why? Because this, unfortunately, is what happens in a broken and distorted world. Humans do these kinds of things. And apart from God's intervention, humans keep finding more sophisticated ways to do these things. The horrors are real. How do you look at the world? How do you think about terrible things that happen? Is it your temptation to say, oh, that was really bad. I'm glad that only happens every now and then. Well, no, here's the thing. The news cycle tells you what to look at. The news cycle does not tell you everything that happens. There's horrors that are happening all the time. They just don't make the news. They make the news of the lives of the people that are experiencing it, but they don't come across our perception unless advertisers and others deem them worthy enough to come across your perception. But otherwise, it's happening all the time. It just depends upon the scale. But if you believe that sin and evil are real, you're actually not surprised. And that doesn't mean, again, diminish talking about it, diminish reflecting on it. It does mean we need the right perspective. Because it was such a surprising event, and because we haven't had lots of those things happen on our soil, that we tend to think, oh, what an exceptional thing. Really, it's not. So we shouldn't be thinking, unfortunately, this could never happen here. No, it can't. It can't. We hope it does not. But these things do happen. I'm curious. Ask yourself this question. How do you face the horrors of the world? What is your strategy for facing those things? How do you interpret those things? How have you learned to interpret those things? And when you do interpret these things, if you call yourself a Christian, is there any sense in which what you believe as a Christian helps you to interpret that? Or is it other dimensions of the culture that are helping you to interpret that? I invite you to interpret it with a Christian lens. Now, if you're facing the horrors of the world, so we look back at tragedy, there's a second thing that we have to look back at. Because when you face the tragedy, it weighs on us. It impacts us. And when that happens, once you get past the shock, you have to deal with the grief. You have to deal with the grief. And I already said that, in America, we might be tended to think these things are exceptional. In America, you know what else we tend to do? We almost tend to think somehow that, at least in the United States, death is even really exceptional. You might say, now, I never said death was exceptional, but think about this. Think about the vocabulary we use for death. Right? Usually, it's convenient ways to get around the fact that it's really heavy. It's convenient ways to get around the fact that it lands on you. And you are powerless to deal with it in terms of overcoming it when you have to face it. You know, my dad died in 2003. He was 70. When I started at Wheaton College, I fully expected my dad to be present this past May when my daughter graduated from college. Right? She was 4 when he died. 3 years later, my mom died. Expected her to be there this past May when my daughter graduated, but she wasn't there. And my point is that I have to contend with that reality. And when I contend with that reality, and when it lands on me, I can't just intellectualize this. I have to actually walk through the grieving process. You know, I remember when, on the day that my mom died, I remember that she was in Maryland. I was flying from Chicago. I talked to her the night before. My brother had told me that something had occurred overnight, so I got a flight. She was standing outside the hospital when my sister and I got there. She picked me up from the airport, and it's like, why is she standing outside the hospital? You know, because I hadn't gotten any news. I just knew that some things had happened, and they were like dealing with the situation. And then, he informed us that she had died. And I said, well, can we go see her? When I'm walking to go see her, I don't know how I'm going to respond. I don't know how I'm going to feel, right? Because I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to kind of like handle this, right? I couldn't. I didn't. We were all in there sobbing like babies, I mean, it just landed on us. And we had to deal with it. And my point is that when you think about something like 9/11, on a mass scale, we're dealing about the fact that there's all of this loss. All these lives gone like that. People were minding their own business on airplanes, minding their own business at work, and then never came home. And actually, some of them, we still don't know what happened to their bodies because of what happened with the planes crashing, what happened with tall buildings crashing to the ground. They haven't recovered everybody 20 years later. What do you do when you face that loss? How do you deal with grief? We have to face the fact that death and loss are real, and that we can't be happy Americans trying to circumvent those things and pretend like, well, if I just kind of go around it enough, it's not really real. It is real. And here's the thing. If you are a Christian, you really can do this and address this. Why? Because you were saved by the man of sorrows. You believe in Jesus. You're called a Christian because of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who identifies us fully divine, yes, but fully human, fully experiencing the full sweep of life as we experience it, including contending with, including facing loss, and including facing his own impending execution and being weighed down tremendously by the specter of that horrific public execution that was impending. If we look at Jesus, we see someone who is acquainted with our sorrows, who's acquainted with our suffering, who has walked through it. Isn't it interesting that when you think about what happened with Lazarus, now, hey, look, he's Jesus. Colossians tells us he's the one that, created all things. He has all power. You know the way the story could have gone? And so they told Jesus that Lazarus had died. And Jesus said, don't worry, I'll be back. And then he goes, and then Jesus shows up. He goes, oh, just move away the stone. Come on out, Lazarus. Now, eventually he does get to the come on out, Lazarus part of it. But what does he do when he gets there? What's the first thing he does, right? He grieves. He weeps. He didn't say, oh, this death thing, it's all just an illusion, you see. Now watch me. Right? No. Before he gets to the now watch me part, which even they're like, what are you doing? He's been in there 4 days. This is going to be overwhelming for us, not because he's dead, but because his body is really offensive right now. But he weeps, he cries, he faces the loss. And then he says, roll away the stone. And come on out, Lazarus. Right? Not because, hey, we don't have to grieve. Not because we don't feel those things. He felt those things. Even when he was going to bring Lazarus out, he faced it. He faced grief. And then he brought him out. He faced his own death, sweating drops that were like blood. And it weighed on him. And he went through death. Now, of course, the thing is, he didn't stay dead. And the difference between his resurrection and Lazarus' resurrection is he got up and death is on borrowed time. With Lazarus, it was only a reprieve until he died again. But when Jesus got up, he's awake, alive, to live forevermore, and now death has seen an hourglass turn. And the sands of the hourglass are running, and eventually the last grain of sand will go through the hourglass, and then it's all going to change. Because of that truth, because he's conquered death, because Easter is real, yes, celebrate the fact that he's risen, but also recognize you have permission to completely feel and embrace the weight of grief when it comes upon you. We just don't do that really well in the United States because we're people of optimism, people who can accomplish anything. And, there are people in Silicon Valley who are trying to, through the use of technology, overcome death. Not just Jeff Bezos, but people like Ray Kurzweil and others, people you've never heard of, investing millions of dollars trying to overcome what they cannot. And because we cannot overcome it, we must face it. It's only overcome by what God will do in Christ when the last day comes and when he raises his people. In the meantime, we must learn to lament. In the meantime, we lament by acknowledging that grief is real and taking it upon ourselves without letting it destroy us, without letting us actually overwhelm us. I say actually overwhelm us because you're going to have your moments. You're going to have the experiences when it just feels like it's just too much. And that's what happens when we walk through grief. And believe me, it's important to learn to walk through grief, but you walk through it and you can lament and be honest about it because grief is not the last word. Hope is the last word. Because Christ has come, Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ is coming again. And he's vanquished death. But death is real. We can say it's real. We can acknowledge the scale that happens in war with death is real. We can cry about it. Uncontrollably, you can cry about it. Knowing that your weeping does not last forever, but you can really weep. Are you able to weep? Are you able to grieve? Or are you so well schooled in Americana that you're really good at going around grief? I encourage you, because of Jesus, to look at grief and say, I can face it. And I can face it because he is with me and because he has shown me the way. Now, we look at tragedy, we look at grief, and now I want us to look back at ourselves. How do we look back at ourselves in light of 9/11? Now, when the tragedy happened, many saw what was going on and thought, what is happening to us? To us as a country. To us in terms of our national identity. We're victims of a horrendous crime, an act of war, no doubt. We, the one superpower, because China wasn't quite where it is now, and this is like 10 years after the Soviet Union was kind of like imploding, so they were still kind of flailing. I mean, and Yeltsin was president. So we were the one superpower. And how is this happening to us? And so here we are under siege, and what do? We had a lot of events where there was certain kinds of memorials, certain kinds of grief, and there were lots of flags at these events. It's great that we were flags. And what were we thinking about? We were thinking about kind of reconstituting ourselves, digging into who we really are as the United States of America. We were stoking our national pride. Not a bad thing at all, because last time I checked, show me a nation that doesn't have national pride. You know what I remember early in my time at Wheaton College? The Balkans War was not yet over, or not much over, and I was driving down a road toward my house. I saw this red car, it had a bumper sticker on it. I didn't understand what the first words were because it wasn't in English, but the translation was under there. It said, "Thank God I'm Serbian," is what it said. I thought to myself, you've got to be kidding. But everybody's proud in the Balkans. But not just only the Balkans, not just only the United States. National pride is everywhere. So national pride is understandable. But we must understand that with national pride comes a great temptation. When we look back, we remember who we're supposed to be in the United States of America. That's great, but here's the temptation. And the temptation particularly with any kind of victimization that occurs from the individual level to the international type of experience. And that is this: to not only regard ourselves as victims, but as a result of our victimization, to strangely find ourselves as uniquely righteous. Uniquely righteous. Why? Because we, in this case the United States of America, look at who, you can't be doing this to us, and do you know who we are? Okay? We're the good guys. And because we're the good guys, right, and really the completely good guys, something like that magnifies our sense of knowing we are the good guys. Now here's the thing, friends. Please understand this. We live in a time when, with what I just said, some of you may be wondering, where's he going with this? Well, probably not where you're thinking. Because we live in a time where it's like, when somebody seems to be getting ready to say something about the US of A, are you getting ready to say to the United States, you are only a devil? How about no, that's not what I'm saying. We're in a time, strangely, because of our ideological polarization, where, you can only call the United States angel or devil. That those are the only things that you can do. Now, that is a really strange way for anybody to be thinking about a nation or about a person. Because last time I checked, human beings are really complex. Last time I checked, nations are complex. Last time I checked, everything in the world has these things where like, even that thing that seems to be mostly evil, there was a moment that was all right. And even things that seem to be, what magnificence, it's like, you know what? There's at least a skeleton in the closet. Everywhere. Okay? There is no escape. I just said in the first point that sin and evil are real. Now, if sin and evil are real, there's no way that we in the United States can think that because we're victimized, that all of a sudden our victimization erases any specter that sin has ever been present on these shores. You may be aware of the fact that my pigmentation's a little bit darker than most of the people in this country, in this room. Now, why am I bringing that up? Because do you know what this country did for most of its history with people of my pigmentation? By law, until the year I was born, 1965. By law, this country said, of course you can discriminate against people on the basis of race. And it's just the way things are supposed to be. That's what this country did for most of its history. And my point is this. If most of our history has been that way, right, and we still actually kind of deal with the reverberations of what you do when you hardwire into a country for a couple of centuries, discrimination. Now, however you want to talk about that, we can talk about that afterwards. But the point is, when that's the case, nobody can say we are righteous. You know, I wonder what a Native American thinks about how righteous the United States of America is. Why am I saying that? My point is not, now you're going to Devil America territory. No, I'm not. I'm going to Complex America territory. There's a reason why people want to come to the United States of America. There's a reason why people want to immigrate here. Now, please understand, there are people in a lot of countries that have no interest in coming to the United States. They are just fine being where they are. But there are a lot of other people that say, please let me come to the United States, to the land of opportunity. Why? Because there are things that happen, that are possible in the United States of America. We're a great country. Great does not mean righteous. Great does not mean without sin. Great means there's so much that we're capable of. But we also are not perfect. Ask the people in the Philippines what they think about how we had our relationship. Ask them about what McKinley thought God said to him that led him to make the choices he made. You know, what was good for the Philippines, which was really what was good for us. Ask them about that. Why am I saying this? My point is, when we look back, we should say, thank God so many great things have happened in this country. Thank God that actually American exceptionalism is a real thing. We're a very unique country. Very unique country. We're a country with a lot of religion, without a state church, and by the way, irrespective of whatever kind of secularization we've had, what kind of pluralism we've got in the country, etc., relative to most of the world, they think we're like a super religious country. We're just not as religious as we were, or as imperfectly religious as we were. We're differently religious. What am I saying? The United States, an exceptional country, yes. A sinless country, no. There's much about our country to appreciate. Wave your flags, but don't worship your flags. Your flag will not save you. Your flag did not get up on a cross and get resurrected 3 days later. In fact, nobody was thinking about that flag back then. And the Bible says nothing about our country. None of that's mentioned. But we are, nonetheless, a great but imperfect country. Can you look at the United States and love it without having to worship it? Can you criticize it and admit that its failings don't mean that it's a devil? This is a great opportunity that we have if we're willing to look back. And we can look back through that lens if we take the reality of sin seriously. If we take the fact that this is God's world and He's created this world and He's made it possible for humans to do wonderful things in this world, like build nations like the United States. If we look through that Christian lens, and if we look through this lens, remembering that God is over all and that the United States is one place among many under Him, you know what that means? It means this. It means, okay, God is over all this. If I'm a Christian, I'm under Him. And since He made all this, He's actually my first loyalty. All other loyalties are secondary. And if all other loyalties are secondary, that actually gives me space to say, God, you're my number one. Everything else is number two or less. And you alone I worship. Everything else, I can actually comfortably look at it and say, here's its blessings, here's its failings. When you're a Christian, you're free to do that. You don't have to worship where you are. What an opportunity if you look at it through a Christian lens. If you look back and say, who are we in our national identity? Looking back at tragedy. Looking back and thinking about grief. Looking back and thinking about national identity. All of those present you with an opportunity with this series of thinking about something that's really an opportunity every moment. And that is to consider, when I think about my looking back of those things and others, what is the Lord showing me about knowing him better? What is he showing me about becoming more like him? What is he showing me about being an agent who is seeking the good, seeking flourishing for the world? Not just my country, but for the world. What is he showing me as I look at my looking back? Are you willing to be open to God showing you how you see things, and showing you how you can see things, and showing you how you can pursue a life where, yes, you flourish, but you flourish amid your seeking the good of others. The good of the others, actually, whether they're in this country or whether they're anywhere else. Are you willing to listen to your life and let God speak to you as you listen to your life? And be prompted to say, how can I become more and more who God wants me to be? It's not always easy to do that, but I invite you to do that. And I think if you do that, and if I do that, you know what could happen? What could happen? I was telling Martin this last night. Imagine if people said, hey, do you know what's happening in Bristol, Tennessee right now? What's happening in Bristol, Tennessee right now is there are all these people who are seeking the good of each other. Oh, you mean because they've all got groupthink? Oh, no. No, actually, they really have some major disagreements. But they've discovered that those disagreements are not greater than the fact that they're all human beings, that they're all created in the image of God, and that they're called to seek the good of each other. And they're trying to do it. And they're trying to live well together. And they're trying, albeit imperfectly, but they keep going step by step. They're trying to show a better way. That opportunity is right here. Are you willing to take that opportunity to listen to your life and let God speak to you so that you can do your part in leading us toward a Christian witness that people might say, oh, is that what Christians mean? Christians are about? Is that what that looks like? What an amazing thing it would be if that's the case. The opportunity is there for all of us. Well, thank you for listening. It's been great to be with you. Blessings.
If you want to spend some time chatting with Vince, we'll be over at the Tadlock Porch with coffee and donuts for a while. He'll be speaking again tonight at 7 o'clock at First Baptist Church downtown. Thank you for being with us this morning. Go and do good.